I'm Harley Smith, and this is the Master Growers course. Today we're going to be looking at carbon dioxide supplementation and environmental control, making the perfect environment for your plants, creating the environment for their special needs. Now, light is the limiting factor for plant growth. But when light is no longer the limiting factor, carbon dioxide becomes the limiting factor to maximize yields. Now remember, plants need 17 essential elements to grow and reproduce, but 3 of them, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, account for over 95% of the plant's dry weight. So if all you're interested in is increasing yield, one of the very best things you can do is think of carbon dioxide as fertilizer for your plant. Increase the CO2 in the atmosphere and you could see 25, 30, even 50% increase in yield. Now, it's very important in an indoor environment that at the minimum, you're replacing the CO2 that the plant takes in. Remember, during photosynthesis, plants take in carbon dioxide through the leaves, through the stomata, the pores, and the bottom of the leaves. They take up water through the roots. And then in the presence of the full spectrum light, red and blue end of the spectrum, they make sugars. Some of those photosynthates they use for energy, to grow, to reproduce. Some of those sugars they store in the flowers and in the fruit, in the roots. And some of them they even leak from the roots to feed the plant growth promoting rhizobacteria and the mycorrhizal fungi. In exchange for those sugars that are made out of carbon dioxide, the microorganisms make organic biostimulants that aid with the uptake of water and minerals. So that starts a whole cycle of production. The more efficiently plants take up water and minerals, the more CO2 availability, the more sugars they can produce, the higher the Brix. And that's one of the goals we have in our Master Growers course, is to grow high Brix plants. If you can grow such healthy plants that the Brix is at 12% or higher, sucking insects won't even recognize the plants as food. So carbon dioxide is the fuel that the plant uses to make the sugars for high Brix plants. The first question that you need to have answered is how much CO2 do we add to make a benefit to the plant? Now, the ambient air around us right now, without CO2 supplementation, is somewhere around 350, maybe 370 parts per million. But in a closed grow room, plants are going to start to deplete that CO2 quite quickly. So at the very least, we have to bring in fresh air to replace the stale air that's been depleted of carbon dioxide. If plants deplete CO2 to 200 parts per million instead of our 350, it's going to dramatically slow down growth. If they deplete it down to 100 parts per million, the plant will stop growing. So at the very least, let's bring in fresh air. Have an exhaust fans in your grow room. Blow out the stale, moist air. Bring in fresh, dry air and replace the CO2 that the plant used up. But if we add supplemental CO2, we're going to see benefits, not just maintaining growth, we're going to see increased growth. If you can raise the CO2 to about 750 to maybe 1,500 parts per million, double or triple the CO2, you can see at least a 20 to 30% increase in yield. Very easily, maybe as much as 50% increase. Now, if you continue to add CO2, you're not going to get the response from the plant. As you add more than, say, 1,500 parts per million, you're going to be wasting carbon dioxide because as you raise CO2 in the atmosphere, the plant starts to adapt to the high CO2 levels. It's going to start to close the stomata. So you add more, you won't see it in increased growth because they're not changing it into sugar. Now, if you go up even higher to about 5,000 parts per million, now you're hurting the plant. You're not just wasting CO2 because the plant will close the stomata so much that it won't be able to release and get rid of the excess heat. When plants are growing and doing cell division, cytokinesis it's called, cell division, heat is a byproduct. So the way plants cool down is through transpiration. As they're growing, they transpire water vapor and oxygen from the leaves, and that takes away some of the heat energy. But if they close the stomata too much because your CO2 is above 5,000 ppm, you're just going to start to burn the plant. It'll start looking like fertilizer burn. The edge of the leaves will start to turn brown, and the leaves will start to get crispy. So don't overdo it. You're not only wasting CO2, you can harm your plants, and it can even be harmful to your workers in that environment. If you have too high a CO2 over time, we need oxygen. And we could start to get lightheaded and dizzy, and if it went up to even higher levels, it could cause harm to humans as well. There are a few different ways to add CO2 to a grow room. You could add tanks of compressed CO2 with a doser and a timer. That's one way. Very good in general because it doesn't add any extra heat or humidity to your room. So it's excellent to do that style of CO2 supplementation in the summertime. Another way is the CO2 generators, and that burns natural gas or propane. When the natural gas and propane are burned, it produces carbon dioxide as a byproduct along with some water vapor. The third way, which is to me very interesting and I've experimented with it in my own labs, is organic carbon. For example, in nature, where does the CO2 come from? Carbon dioxide. Well, when I was a boy in 6th grade science class, the teacher told me that animals breathe in oxygen and we produce CO2. Plants take in CO2 and they produce oxygen. And that answered the question. But a little bit later on, I started thinking, wait a minute, there's not enough squirrels in the forest to grow enough, make enough CO2 to make those giant oak trees, even if they're running around huffing and puffing all day long. So where does the CO2 really come from in nature? It comes from decaying organic matter. The tree falls in the forest. It's attacked by primary decomposers, such as fungi, such as oyster mushrooms, and they start to degrade the organic matter to produce CO2. That's where most of the CO2 comes from, microorganisms in the soil with respiration of organic matter. So I got to think, what if we followed the course of nature and did organic CO2? So we did some experiments. Take a bale of straw, either rye straw or wheat straw. Inoculate it with oyster mushroom spawn in bags. 2 weeks after you inoculate it, the plants, as the mycelium is growing through the straw, it starts to produce 240,000 parts per million CO2. 2 weeks later, you get your first flush of mushrooms. 2 weeks after that, a second flush. 2 weeks after that, your third and final flush of mushrooms. And at that point, over 50% of the mass of the straw has been converted to carbon dioxide. Now that is alternative energy at its finest. You also can harvest the mushrooms. A little clump of oyster mushrooms in Detroit in a market sells for $2 or $3. So you can make enough money as a secondary product to pay for part of your light bill to grow your plants and increase the yield by 20 to 30 or even 50%. So that is organic CO2. The more conventional way of producing CO2, more for commercial growing or for most indoor grow rooms though, would be either the bottled CO2 or the CO2 generator. If you want to keep it simple, bring in bottled CO2 because we have dosers available you can attach right to the tank and also timers. So you calculate the dosage rate, how many cubic feet per hour, along with the time. And you can add CO2 right to your room. Give you an example. Let's say you have a 10 by 10 by 10 grow room. 10 feet long, 10 feet wide, 10 feet high. Multiply length times width times height, you get the cubic feet. So a 10 by 10 by 10 grow room has about 1,000 cubic feet of air. Now, if you want to add 1,200 parts per million, all you have to do is multiply your 1,000 cubic feet by 1,200 parts per million. And 1,200 parts per million is a decimal number, 0.001200. Remember, it's tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10,000ths, 100,000ths, millions. So 0.0012 is 1,200 millionths, or 1,200 parts per million. So multiply that, and then you'll know how many cubic feet. So 1,000 times 1,200 millionths equals 1.2 cubic feet. That's how much CO2 to add to your room to reach a target of 1,200 ppm. Now, let's set the doser. Most dosing rates can be set somewhere between 5 cubic feet per hour and 15 cubic feet per hour. So we'll set the solenoid valve, keep it simple, we'll do it at 10 cubic feet per hour. Now, how long do we have to dose it to reach that 1,200 ppm? All you do is divide 1.2 cubic feet, that's the total carbon dioxide you're adding to the air, by 10, because it's 10 cubic feet per hour. That gives you 0.12 hours. So that's it. You set your timer, set your dose rate, 10 cubic feet per hour. You added 1,200 ppm to your room. Oh, by the way, your timer may not be calibrated in hours. So how do you convert 0.12 hours to minutes? 60 minutes in an hour, right? Just multiply 0.12 times 60, which comes out to about 7.2 minutes. So set your doser, 10 cubic feet per hour. Set your timer for 7.5 minutes. You've filled your room up with CO2 to 1,200 ppm. Now, it's best to do that quickly. I want to fill up my room in about 5 to 10 minutes. I don't want to slowly add CO2 because that higher levels are going to have more of an impact on the growth rate of the plant. So if I exhaust the air with an exhaust fan, I want to refill the room with CO2 in just 5 to 10 minutes. The third option for adding CO2 is using a CO2 generator, and that's a specially designed burner that burns natural gas or propane and converts it into carbon dioxide. Now, make sure, though, that if you put in a CO2 generator, it's specifically designed to make CO2. Don't just make your own at home, because if you don't get complete combustion of the natural gas or propane, you can also get carbon monoxide as a byproduct. So you want to have something that's burning in a very pure blue flame with no yellow or soot being generated by that flame. In fact, in some of the hydroponic greenhouses, when they add CO2 supplementation, they're using boilers, big boilers that burn the natural gas, and with computer sensors attached. So even if you lit a cigarette in front of that boiler, the computer would sense the carbon monoxide in the air from the cigarette and shut down the whole boiler. So make sure there's not incomplete combustion. Make sure that they're maintained well and that they're designed specifically to make CO2. Also, if there's incomplete combustion, besides carbon monoxide, you'll get a little bit of ethylene as a byproduct. And that's going to have more of a damaging effect on the plant even than the carbon monoxide would. A small amount of ethylene gas acts as a hormone to the plant that tells the plant it's getting older. It's time to shed its leaf. So if you had even a small amount of extra ethylene, you could get premature senescence, where it'll shed the leaves even before the crop is ready. If you have 50 parts per million of carbon monoxide in the air, more than likely you have about 0.05 parts per million of ethylene, enough to do damage to your plant. Next, let's talk about temperature and humidity control a little bit. When you're growing indoors, you have to create the environment that's the most conducive to your strains. So if you're growing outdoors, you have no control. You want to make sure you choose the genetics that are suitable for that environment. But if you're growing indoors, you can create the environment for any strain of plant, whether it's tropical or it's Arctic, just by controlling temperature and relative humidity. First, let's talk about temperature. For indoor growing, a temperature range of 68 to 78 degrees is ideal. Now, if you're adding CO2 supplementation, you can raise the temperature by 5 degrees without stressing the plant. And that's because if you have high CO2, the plant will preferentially take in the carbon dioxide instead of the oxygen. So the plant doesn't go into photorespiration with higher temperatures. So you can, if you normally run your temperatures at 78 degrees, you can go easily up to 83 degrees without stressing the plant. But once you get up to 85 and higher for an extended period of time, it's going to start hurting the performance of your plant. They're not going to be able to transpire enough water to keep cool. They might not be able to take up enough water, and you're going to start seeing damage to the roots and to the leaves. Normally growing indoors, you're going to be adding artificial lights that are going to raise the temperature. So you have to get rid of some of the excess heat. There are 3 ways you can do that. One is just passive vents. You can open a window or open a door and you can see the temperatures go down easily by 5 degrees. Very simple, so that when the plants are transpiring their water to keep cool, that they have some airflow with fresh air coming in. Not only is it cooler and drier air, but it also helps the plant cool itself. Another way is to have exhaust fans. And what you'll do there is you'll have a thermostat or a humidistat. And if the temperature or the humidity hits the fixed point that you programmed in, an exhaust fan turns on to exhaust the hot, moist air and bring in fresh. I like to see a second fan as well. A small fan that brings in fresh air. So as we're exhausting the old, we're bringing in the new very quickly. I want to replace all the air in that grow room in 5 minutes. So to do that, I need to have a fan, an exhaust fan that's rated high enough to exhaust all the air. For example, you have a 1,000 cubic foot room. You want to exhaust all the air in 5 minutes. You need 200 cubic feet per minute rated exhaust fan to do that. Your third option is using an air conditioner. Now, air conditioning, very effective. We're in the modern age, but it's expensive. You're adding a lot to your electrical bill. So your first 2 stages with the vents, passive vents, exhaust fans should be your first choices. But if you have to go further than that, then air conditioning works well. Now, one tip I have is make sure if you're using an air conditioner that the cold air isn't blowing directly on the leaves. I've seen it in some grow rooms in the past that I've visited where they have the cold air mixing with the warm, moist air from the lights. And when that happens, that warmer air from the plant and from the lights where the plant's transpiring moisture mixes with the cold air. It's like a cold front. The air starts to condense moisture at the cooler temperatures. You could have 100% relative humidity right where the cold air meets the warm air from the lights. And then that sets up the environment for powdery mildew and for fungi, just in that microclimate. So once it gets established, that it can spread all the way through the grow room. And I've seen it. So what's the solution? Just take a horizontal fan for air movement and blow it along the wall. So when the cold air comes in from the air conditioner, instead of it blowing directly on the plants, it's circulating in the room to gradually lower the temperatures without affecting the relative humidity in the microclimate. Remember too that plants transpire water to keep cool. So don't forget air movement. That's often overlooked in a grow room. I went into a commercial facility. It was a biotech manufacturing facility. They brought in 1,200 1,000-watt lights to make medicine in this warehouse. Well, they forgot air movement. They had stagnant air. The plants stopped growing. The plants closest to the lights did the worst, so they brought me in to try to solve their problem. It took me 5 minutes. I looked around. I said, "Where's the wind? Where's the breeze?" "Oh, what do you mean?" "Well, plants transpire moisture to keep cool. Even though your temperatures and humidity are under control, it's stagnant air. The leaves aren't moving. It sets up a water vapor barrier on the bottom of the leaves. The next thing you know, plants can't take in CO2. They go into photorespiration. Instead of taking in carbon dioxide and making sugars to grow, they take in oxygen and they burn the sugars, and the plants stop growing." So they wanted me to make some fancy biostimulant product to help prevent the plants from suffering from the diseases that they were getting in that environment. I said, "Yeah, I could do that. I'll charge you a lot of money, but I'm not going to do it." You need to change the environment first, because if you had a biostimulant, you're still going to get bad results if you don't have the environment, and then you're going to blame me. So the answer is, bring in some oscillating fans. Bring in horizontal air movement. Once they did that, it solved the problem and saved the day. And they never called me back. So I guess I could have made more money, but it's all about the plants. And in this case, it's all about the medicine that was doing a lot of good to a lot of people around the world. So I don't sweat losing a few dollars, but remember that. Air movement's important, at least enough air movement so all of the leaves in your grow room, all of them, are moving at least a little bit. Not a hurricane. You don't want air blowing on one part of the greenhouse strongly, because if it's too windy, the plant will close the stomata again to conserve the water. And when that happens, you can get windburn. So gentle breeze, small changes to the environment, but replace the air in the grow room very quickly. Another thing to remember when you're setting up your environment is that the leaf temperature changes faster than the bud temperature or the fruit temperature. And if you know that and can manipulate your environment, you can get some extra benefits as well. For example, some of the tomato growers in Canada will lower the temperature to the nighttime temperature very quickly. In other words, as the light levels go down at dusk, the computer changes the temperature very quickly. The leaf cools down faster than the buds and the fruit. So the photosynthase and the water go into the fruit. You get bigger fruit that way. Another way to manipulate that is early in the morning. The opposite happens because the buds have more water than the leaves. It takes them longer to warm up. So if you just controlled your temperature on your air temperature and not the leaf temperature early in the morning, after the sun comes up, the leaves will start to transpire water because they warm up faster than the buds, but then the buds are cooler, so that water condenses on the buds and can set up an environment for bud rot. So in that case, when you warm up the temperatures in the morning, don't wait for the air temperature to warm up. Use your timer so it warms up more quickly and prevents those problems. To control the leaf temperature in some of the research greenhouses, they have infrared detectors that measure the temperature of the leaf. In commercial growing, though, they don't go that far. They just have a green leaf sensor that's the same color as the leaf, so it absorbs the leaf, heat and the light about the same way that the leaf would. So you can see what the leaf temperature is at different times of the day. And they'll use that data to determine how much to water the plants, but how much is going to transpire water. And finally, don't forget root temperature. Remember, the warmer the water in the root zone, the warmer the temperature, the less dissolved oxygen it'll hold. You want to control the root zone temperature somewhere between 68 and 75 degrees, because the warmer the water, the less dissolved oxygen. And plants need oxygen for metabolism as well as temperature. So we have to find that perfect balance. So 68 to 72 degrees is ideal. If you go below 62 degrees, it's going to start shutting down. cellular metabolism and the respiration of the plant. Even though there's plenty of oxygen, it's not enough warmth. You get below 58 degrees, the plant will stop growing at the root zone. It won't take up enough phosphorus anymore. Phosphorus is temperature dependent. There has to be active transport, burning of the sugars in the roots for the plant to adequately take it up. In the Netherlands, it's standard operating procedure to monitor and control air temperature, leaf temperature, and the root temperature, the substrate temperature. Now, we can control that, and often do in commercial production. For example, in Minnesota, where in the greenhouses where they're doing NFT production of lettuce, and the temperatures of the air get too low, they just warm the substrate temperature. They warm up the water to about 75 degrees. That keeps the uptake of water and minerals at the high level, so even though there's lower air temperature, it doesn't slow down the growth of the plant. So on the other side, if you have too cold of water, it shuts down the uptake of phosphorus. Phosphorus is temperature dependent. I visited a greenhouse many years ago, 20 years ago, when I was doing some of my first projects and first consulting in hydroponics. And there was a greenhouse grower in northern Michigan that was getting a zinc deficiency and couldn't figure out why. He said that there was plenty of zinc in the nutrients, but they were getting deficiency in the leaves. Well, I did a little research and found out that it had to do with the uptake of phosphorus. A phosphorus toxicity shows up as a zinc deficiency, and phosphorus is temperature dependent. If the temperatures are too cold, the plant doesn't take up enough phosphorus, so it starts building up in the root zone. Then all of a sudden you get 4 or 5 warm days in a row, plant takes up a whole bunch of phosphorus, zinc deficiency. So controlling the root zone temperature is very important. If you're growing in cold temperatures in the winter, you want to make sure that you warm up your nutrients. Also, keep your reservoir off the floor. If you have a cement floor, it'll act as a heat sink and it'll take some of the temperature off. I even put a submersible heater, an aquarium heater, in my reservoirs in the winter. But the rest of the time in the summer, you want to make sure your reservoirs are in the shade, maybe partially bury them if you can, so you can keep them a little cooler in the summer. But keep them in the zone between 68, 75 degrees. You'll get optimal root development, optimal uptake of nutrients, and optimal cellular metabolism of the root zone. And finally, let's take a quick look at relative humidity. In an indoor grow room, try to keep the relative humidity somewhere between 40 and 60%. If the humidity is too high, the plant won't transpire enough water, and you can get calcium deficiency, even if there's plenty of calcium at the root zone. If the relative humidity is too low, if the air is too dry, plants may not be able to take up enough water to cool themselves down, and you can start to get burning of the leaves and stalling of the growth of the plant. So keep it between 40 and 60% is generally safe. Now during vegetative growth, you could stay on the high side. When you're first germinating your seeds, you could be 98% humidity. But slowly you want to lower the relative humidity so the plant has a chance to adapt. If during vegetative growth, I'd rather see it at 60% all the time than see big differences in relative humidity from day to day. If you have high relative humidity one day and low relative humidity the next day, that can hurt the plant. Let's say you got a little bit of powdery mildew from high humidity. Well, if you lower it too quickly, it causes the spores of the powdery mildew to develop and spread through the garden. So try to keep it a little more even if you can. That's why I recommend too having a high-low, min-max temperature and humidity humostat so that you can see what the high temperatures are for the day, the low temperatures are for the day, the high humidities and the low, so that you can keep it more even. So during vegetative growth, you can keep the relative humidity a little bit on the high side. Slow down the uptake of water and minerals just a little. During heavy flowering, I like to see about 50% relative humidity, just to create a little bit of healthy stress on the plant, but still keep fruit and flower production at maximum. But toward the end, if you can, lower the relative humidity closer to 50%. It makes it a little bit more difficult for the plant to take up water, and in response, the plants are going to start to make more of the aromas and the flavors and the resins that will help in the quality of the final product. Okay, to finish up today's presentation, let's take a little tour of a commercial greenhouse in Arizona. I visited this greenhouse years ago. It's 200 acres under glass in Wilcox, Arizona, and they were growing hydroponic tomatoes. The first slide you hear is an overview of the greenhouse complex. Horizon to horizon, all you see is greenhouse bays. Go around. Here's looking down one aisle in the greenhouse. That little dot in the distance is a person walking toward us on one row in this huge greenhouse complex. It took him about 10 minutes to get to us. The entire greenhouse complex, though, is controlled by a computer environmental control system. They have light sensors in the greenhouse that measure the accumulated sunlight and intensity every 10 minutes and adjust the nighttime temperatures according to how much light the plant received the previous day. They have weather stations on the roof that measure the wind direction and velocity and adjust the vent positions according to the prevailing wind. Also, they control the carbon dioxide supplementation. They have a CO2 generator boilers that are 2 stories high to burn natural gas. They're so accurate, though, and so precise that if you even lit a cigarette in front of that boiler, the computer would sense the carbon monoxide in the air, shut down the whole boiler. Now, remember, plants use carbon dioxide only during the day. They don't use CO2 supplementation at night. So during the day, as they were producing CO2 for the plant, they were pumping hot water into insulated storage tanks in the desert. So at night, the computer would literally pump that hot water through pipes in the greenhouse to warm the root zone, which is really important at night, and for the heat to go up through the canopy of the plant to keep it warm at night. Now, they were so precise too. You want no more than 10 degrees difference in temperature between day and nighttime temperature. The bigger the difference between day and night temperature, the more stretching. So by controlling the photosynthesis and respiration with day and night temperature, they could get that nice 2-inch internodal length all the way up the plant. That tighter nodes meant more production in the same space. To do double duty, those same heating pipes that warm up the greenhouse were used for the tracks for their carts, for doing the harvesting, for doing the pruning of the plants. So they were doing double duty. Also, the nutrients were controlled by the computer. Each of the trace elements were stored in tanks. All of the macro elements were stored in tanks. Using computer-controlled valves, the computer could actually change the recipes of the nutrients for different stages of the plant's growth. Also, they could change the nutrients according to the prevailing environmental conditions. If there was lots of light and lots of CO2 in the peak of the day, they'd have as much as 2,000 parts per million of carbon dioxide, and they'd adjust the ammonium to nitrate ratio for the ideal growth of the plant. When there's high CO2, the plant doesn't take up as much nitrate nitrogen. They use more of the ammonium. So the computer would sense that, adjust the nutrients for spoon feeding the crop. Also, during different stages of the plant's growth, they'd add more phosphorus. They'd add more potassium. They'd add boron at just the right levels as the fruit was starting to get larger. So the sugars would flow more efficiently and that the tissue would be denser and higher quality with more sugars. And the results, by controlling the temperature, by controlling the humidity, by controlling the CO2 and all of the essential elements, they're able to maximize yield in the same environment. Thanks for attending today's class on temperature and environmental control, and I hope to see you in future classes.